Welcome back for part 2 of Nathalie Himmelrich's interview.
Of course, from that point in time, I looked forward to having twins and be prepared for twins, because you think about, okay, now you're pregnant, you're preparing for one child, and then you say, okay, let's have a look at what we need for two. But then on the 19-week, the big scan, they took quite a long time, and then the lady said, well, one twin has polycystic cysts in her kidneys. And I was naive and I had no idea. I didn't even sort of know at that time or consciously knew that even though my mother had a miscarriage and I knew about that, it wasn't in my bubble of being pregnant. It wasn't something that baby can die in utero, baby can die at birth, or baby can die in the first few days after birth. It wasn't something I busied my mind with.
And do I recall that at that point you had already named both girls?
No. At
Not
that
yet?
time, no.
Okay.
At that time, during the pregnancy, they named them A and B, or 1 and 2. So then, after that 19 weeks scan, obviously we were becoming conscious. Okay, something's going on. We started, as everyone does, going down the loophole of Googling or finding medical advice online. And they also said, let's go and check it out with your OBGYN and with specialists to see what that means. And my gynecologist, she said, well, it's one thing to see that on the scan, but we'll have to wait further down the pregnancy to be able to say more. And so from that point on, week 19, which coincided with another event in my family, which we'll probably go on speak about later in regards to my mother's condition, we sort of were on hold. What does that mean? And so then we had multiple scans, more regular scans, because they wanted to see how the amniotic fluid differed. Because in my case, there were, so I'm not good with those names, but they had two different sacs of amniotic fluid. And with polycystic kidneys, the question is, how is the plumbing, or what they called, how is it connected inside their bodies? Can the baby produce fluids or not? And they can measure that according to the amniotic fluid. And so at week 26, in another ultrasound, I sort of developed a fear of black dots, because that were the cysts in the kidneys. And I was becoming more and more anxious, of course. And then this doctor who did the ultrasound, he took us into a room and said, you have to consider terminating one baby for the sake of the other, or think about palliative care. Now, I was in complete shock, because we had already discussed with my gynecologist that we were not considering early termination. So while I'm saying that, I can notice actually some tension in my dorsal area, in my pelvis, not in pelvis, in my stomach, and also some reactions on my forehead here. And I can also feel my heartbeat going a bit faster. I'm just noticing also those somatic markers. And I was in shock, like this person that I didn't even know, this doctor, sort of put us into the state of, and I said, is there a reason for my other baby that survival is better? And I don't know if it was him saying it or someone else, but it became clear that there wouldn't be, it wouldn't impact one baby's life. So I was shocked to imagine what he would say, to terminate one baby for the chance of the other, or for, I don't know why he said that. But according to him, twins anyway should be born around week 35. That was his view. We didn't like this person, or anyway, he spoke to us in a way that wasn't beneficial to us and wasn't what we agreed.
Right.
But it put me into shock, like complete shock. While at the same time, I was still pregnant with twins, and people would ask me, oh, you must be looking forward. Aren't you happy you're having twins? And I was
It's so hard.
not really sure what to say, because yes, I was happy, but I was also in in a shock, also in anticipatory grief, not knowing what would happen, hope.
Right.
And so that around
It's
that
carrying
time,
all those emotions simultaneously,
yeah,
trying to balance. And it's so hard, I know, even on my side, so different. But after my husband committed suicide, I hated seeing people because they would ask questions like, you know, didn't you know that was going to happen, or didn't you see something wrong with him? Or they would say things like, and it's just, it was one of those places I'm carrying this big grief, and they would say, well, just enjoy the times you had. Just remember the times you had and enjoy them. And I would get so angry. So I'd be like, don't you know I'm in such sorrow that I can't even think that way? So in some small way I can relate. It's very different, but it's people have no idea what they're doing to you because they don't know what you're holding.
yeah.
The juxtaposition of all those emotions.
And I think in specifics with doctors who treat parents who are pregnant, who are expecting and have complications, I would hope, and this would be not just a hope, but a requirement for people like that to be more trained in understanding how to be with those people that are already scrambling around what does that mean for me, for my
Right.
child.
I agree. I agree. So what happened? You're at week 26. You've had this encounter with this doctor who was not a very generous listener. Um, and take me from there, if you will.
Yeah, so you asked before about the names. So around that time, because of the multitude of scans, I didn't want the children to be nameless or to be just referred to A and B or 1 and 2. And so my husband at that time, he said, why don't we pull some cards out of an oracle card deck of angels? And I was like, angels, you? Anyway, we chose hope and passion. So it was very, very, very actually accurate, because passion, my child that is now 13 and a half, she's very passionate, very full of life. And hope, we were in all that time, we were persevering with hope, not knowing what would happen at the end. And so by that stage, I didn't want to see that doctor anymore. And there was another person who did our scans. I was very clear what I wanted. And I think with the support of my husband, we could then actually name, okay, we don't want this person to do our scans anymore. And my gynecologist, who was actually giving birth in another hospital, she made sure that she could give birth to my babies. And she said, then let's go forward to week 34. We had an ultrasound. And at that time, the amniotic fluid of Hope was getting to the point where she said, okay, it would be better if they were born. And so I gave birth short of 35 weeks, or it was a C-section, a beautiful C-section, family-centered C-section, which was beautifully prepared. In Australia, you can have quite a lot of input into how you want to have this process happen. And they
love that.
followed our wishes to the dot, which was very helpful as well for me to have a good experience with that, with not knowing what would happen. And then those two babies, they were 2 kilos and 1.7. I don't know what that is in different measurements, but tiny, really tiny. And then they went to the NICU, and so Hope, who was the baby with the polycystic kidneys, she was on CPAP and different support and passion, or what she's called in life. Ananda May was also in a humidity crib, but she was doing okay. And then in the second night, Hope had collapsed lung. And they were trying to call me to find out what I wanted to do about it, but I didn't pick up. I saw that there was an unknown number, so I didn't pick up. And they did open up the side of it just to release it so that she would have a chance of continuing, because they couldn't talk to me. So then I went down to the NICU. I was in the hospital at that stage, obviously. And to me, it was from the conversations that we had when they were alive and what they would see. This to me was a sign for my daughter to say, I'm ready to go. She's given me, with the other information that we had, she was saying, okay, it's time for me. And we had quite a good support network there in terms of the NICU nurses and a social worker, because obviously that's not something you're prepared, that's not
Right.
something you know how to do. And they would lead us through the next steps of what we could do to keep memories, how we could let her go, how we could what's called withdraw care. So it was very nicely mediated or coached into the process. So
What a gift you had in
yeah,
that.
I think it's a huge gift that you can give someone in a situation like that, to be given time.
Where was your mind and heart in those moments in the NICU? You knew her spirit was transitioning. You knew that you were not going to raise two girls, you were going to raise one. But she was still alive. You were holding her, right?
So it was moment to moment. So at that time, I don't recall any thought of a little bit too far in the future. It was moment to moment. So I wasn't able to hold her until at the end, because physical touch for newborns like that under such intense needs in terms of air and so forth, the sensation of being touched is too intense. However, I wasn't able to hold her, but we were able to touch her through the openings. So I was touching her fingers, for example. And I was just looking forward to hold two babies. That
Yeah.
was one of the images that I had, that I wanted. And so to make the decision to withdraw her care, I can't say that I was having clear thoughts about what that would mean at that time. It was just something that was right in the moment. And you don't make that decision lightly, but I also knew I didn't want to extend her suffering, because from the information we had and the possibilities that were available for medicine at that time, with the condition she had Potter syndrome, what's called Potter syndrome, were not so that it was possible to make her survive to a point without extreme measurements that they said it involves more and more pain in terms of infections and so forth. So when we did the process of, and it's called end of life care, there was a sort of different things that happened. First of all, it was during the time where the NICU kids have a break, which is during 1 and 3 p.m., where all parents have to leave, where it's just the NICU babies in the humidity crib, and obviously there's sound and noises and the NICU nurses, but there's no other visitor. And the NICU nurse that was assigned to Amaya is her name, or Hope, she just mediated me to, okay, this is what we can do. And one thing I said, I want my two babies, have them on my arm, and I want them together, because they were separated by birth. And they were not together anymore because of the demands that each had, which was different. And the nurse that was assigned to Ananda May said, no, she can't be moved. And I was adamant. I said, this will be possible. We will make this happen. So I actually had them on my chest, on skin to skin, them together. And there's pictures of that, which is just, I'm so happy in that moment. Yeah, I see pictures of myself, and I was so elated. And in that moment, then obviously the moment continued, and Ananda May went to my husband, so we had one each on our chest, skin to skin, and those two babies, and just experience being parents of those two in those moments, and outside the body, as opposed to me having them both inside, right? And then slowly they coached us through what would happen. And also we had there's a volunteer organization in Australia similar to Now I Lay Me Down to Sleep in the States, which is called Heartfelt, which they have a person come to you and take photos of your child that might be terminally sick, and because I knew about them, I had found out in my pregnancy we invited her, and she took pictures before, so on the first day. But then when we knew we were deciding to withdraw care, we invited her to come to that. And she only later told me that was her first end of life session. And I didn't know what that meant. You know, like being part of someone dying is a interesting thought, right? But interestingly for me, you know, in that moment of having her on my arm, and I still remember she was still moving her hand, which was unusual. She was reaching out up to me, and then we disconnected her tubes, and also seeing that life in that being. And I was acutely aware of the reality that I had just given birth to this being. And I'm here now at the portal of her going out of life. And it was such an honor for me to be allowed to be present in that, at the same time as having this huge wave of grief coming out of me. Because as a mother, of course, that meant no more of those experiences, no more of those carrying, of breastfeeding, and of all of that. So without having those immediate thoughts, but there was this big wave of grief. And actually my sister at the time, she was in the process of making a video of me holding her. And she was, I think, just so shocked of me with that wave of grief, which I later then had in my mother's situation as well. So I know that. She was like, she stopped the video. But for me, I still remember that synchronicity of those two things going on at the same time, both the awe of the experience of that moment. I find it hard to find words to truly experience that, because people listening to that can imagine, oh my God, if my child dies and if I were to hold her in my arms or him, they'd rather not. They usually say, I can't imagine what it feels like, but they could if they wanted to, but I'd rather not. But for me, to be allowed that grace, that honor to be present for her coming in and going, let's say, out, we don't know where it's in and out, that was a huge honor that I felt so privileged to have.
So sacred, such a sacred place. And you were so unusually to me, self-aware to be able to even think about that as you were also holding this enormous grief.
Even now when I talk about it, because, you know, I said before, I'm aware of my physical reactions. Like when I talk about that moment, I feel like a sort of a pit in my stomach a little bit, but also this big light and
You tell it that way. I'm on the other side of you. You're not looking at yourself. As you're telling this story, and I'm on this side crying because it's so powerful and it's, just hurts so much. But you tell it with this sense almost of joy. You felt joy even in that grief. You do feel that light. I think you feel her presence. There's something that radiates within you when you tell it.
And it's not to undermine the grief. It's not to say it wasn't there. And the months afterwards, which we're probably going to come to. So it's not saying it's all rosy and I'm in such awe about having created life and then let her move out of life again. It's simultaneous. It's not either or, it's and. And I think it's important because that moment, even in my memory, is such a lightful moment. And I like to remember it because it is not just the sadness of her death. It is also the honor of being her mother, of having given birth, of having been present in her dying, as we call it, or in her transition. That is, I wasn't present in anyone else's death so far. I think it's a real honor.
That's beautifully told. It's hard to move past it. It's hard to keep an interview going. That's absolutely gorgeous.
And I think it's also beautiful to give that space, in that moment, that the timelessness of that moment. I mean, afterwards, there were other things happening, but by telling the story, it's like there's this space that opens up of this amazing experience of life, whether it's 3 days long or 83 years old long, or it's still this amazing creation that happens within that.
It's beautiful. Thank you.
And the impact she had on me is not limited by the amount of time she was physically here.
Talk
I mean,
about
the
that
things
for a
that-
minute, because it's been 13 and a half years, right? Am I right?
Yeah, yeah. So the things that came not because of her death or her life, but despite of it, what happened within me, from me, through me, as an essence from it, as a condition through it. Would I have written 6 books without this experience? Probably not. I mean, it was never one of the things on my bucket list. It wasn't.
And I love that you wrote the book Grieving for Parents. Yeah, but 6 books in 13 years is daunting. You know that, right?
Yeah, I didn't know when I did it. It was sort of like a choiceless choice, but yeah. So yeah, things that came through me as part of that experience wouldn't have happened. Now, anyone will say, would I have wished that to happen, for that to happen? No, but that's not the question here, right? It's not, I wish for that so I can write 6 books. No, it just happens. That's life and death. And then the question is, what do we do with it?
Next week on the Soul Talks, Nathalie shares how her daughter Hope's life inspired her healing work and how grief became a path to purpose. Join us for part 3.